So we will be looking at the modern novel at the beginning of the 20th century, and we will also be looking very specifically at Mrs. Dalloway today. In order to introduce Mrs. Dalloway, I want to set up some context for what's going on in the novel in general, and then specifically what's going on as the context for the circumstances in this novel. When we're talking about the modern novel, a couple of things you need to keep in mind. The first one is that the early 20th century writers of novels are writing within a very well-established convention of the novel, and they're very much aware of that it's well established. But they're also, like many younger generations, they're very self-conscious about their relationship to their forebears. Like many young people who are establishing their own identity for the first time, one of the ways they establish their identity is by deliberately setting themselves against previous generations. And so the modernist novelists were very self-consciously opposing themselves to their Victorian predecessors and the practices they had followed, and generally did not have many good things to say about popular Victorian novelists. Famously, Dickens was dismissed as Mr. Popular Sentiment. Henry James called Dickens' novels loose, baggy monsters. Virginia Woolf has an essay in which she sort of lovingly makes fun of eminent Victorians. That's the title of the essay, is Eminent Victorians. So they're very much establishing themselves in contrast to the previous generation. Also, they're very much establishing themselves in contrast to the genre and the presuppositions. The 19th century novel is often looked at as sort of the height of the quote-unquote realistic novel. The attempt to, as Ian Watt describes it in Rise of the Novel, to create formal realism, which is the notion that this is a history of something that really happened, and that you could really go to these places and meet these people, and that somehow the world of the novel is contiguous with our own world. So they would set it in real places, and even if they didn't set it in real places, those places would become sort of real for the readers, so that Jane Austen's readers would really want to go see Pemberley, which really doesn't exist, although it's based on a real place. Or the novelist would use settings where they would blank out the name using only the first initial because they wanted to give the impression that they were hiding the name of the real place to protect the identities of the innocent. So the formal realism establishes this notion that somehow the world is contiguous with our own. There's something inherently unreal about formal realism, however, because generally the formally realistic novel, the dominant mode of the Victorian novel, although there are obvious and prominent exceptions, is that it has a omniscient narrator, usually nameless, and although they may have characters, although we may be able to characterize the narrator as cynical or joyous or something like that, there's an omniscient narrator that knows what's going on and knows what people are thinking and can see into the past and even into the future. We have many, many first-person novels like Jane Eyre, for example, or novels that combine them like Bleak House, which has two narrators. One is the omniscient narrator, and the other was Esther Summerson, who's a character in the novel. But the idea of an omniscient narrator who knows what's going on and knows what people are thinking is in itself inherently unrealistic. So the Victorian novel creates what was accepted as somehow a convention of realism, but is inherently unrealistic. Nobody knows everything that's going on. No one can read minds. No one knows the past. No one has this sort of complete omnipresence and is able to tell what's going on. And so the narrative of the modern novel distances itself from the omniscient narrator. It's very hard to find an omniscient narrator in a modern novel. We've even seen this in Heart of Darkness, where the narrators are two different people. One's Marlowe, and the other is the nameless narrator who tells the story. But we have narrators, for instance, Henry James in his novel creates narratives that are told in the third person, but are told from the perspective of specific characters. It's an indirect discourse kind of narrative told from the perspective of a specific character. And so we see things as that character would. So in Henry James' novel, What Maisie Knew, Maisie is an 11-year-old girl who's being used as sort of a hockey puck in an acrimonious divorce. And she loves both her parents, and we see her parents from her sort of innocent and childlike perspective. But of course, we're able to distance ourselves from that perspective and realize that her parents are a couple of jerks, and that she's being ill-used. And so we see the story from her perspective, even though it's told in third person. We have also narrators, first-person narrators like Ford Madox Ford's brilliant novel, The Good Soldier. In The Good Soldier, Ford Madox Ford's main character starts off the novel with, "I don't know." So this is a narrative of a man who doesn't know the story he's telling. And in fact, as we watch the story unfold, what is actually happening is the narrator is discovering what has really been happening all along as he goes. And the world that he thought he lived in was completely false. He was completely mistaken about what's going on. In the novel, this narrator is a wealthy American who marries a young American woman. And on their honeymoon, they're crossing the Atlantic in an ocean liner, and she has a heart problem. And so the first thing is that because she has a heart problem, they're unable to sleep together in the same bedroom because the activities of the marital bed would threaten her life because she simply is incapable of enduring excitement. And so they're sleeping in separate staterooms as they on their honeymoon journey. They get to Europe, and he's wealthy enough that he can support this kind of lifestyle. So the narrator who's telling the story takes them to a series of different watering holes and spas so that he can help her recover. The goal is for him to help her gain her health back. And so they're going to these spas. And on the travel through these spas, they meet another couple, a British couple, a retired soldier and his wife. And so they end up traveling together through all these different spas. And they do this for a series of years. And they become very close friends. What ends up happening is that eventually his wife passes away. And when his wife passes away, he comes to discover that, number one, his wife never had a heart problem at all, that she had been sleeping with a variety of different people, most recently with his best friend. His best friend and his wife had been having an affair, which was encouraged by his best friend's wife because his best friend's wife knew that her husband was a serial philanderer, a cheater, and they couldn't get a divorce because she's Catholic. And so she actually encouraged the affair because at least she would know who her husband was sleeping with, as long as she was sleeping with their friend. The only person who doesn't know all of this is going on is the woman's husband, the narrator of the story. And so at the beginning of the story, he has literally just discovered that everything he thought he knew about his life since he married this woman has been a lie. That his wife does not have a heart problem. She simply doesn't want to sleep with him. And the reason she wants to have a separate stateroom is so she can sleep with other people. His wife has been sleeping with his best friend, and his best friend's wife has known about it all the time and has been actually encouraging it. He ends up telling the story over and over again, several different times, starting from the beginning. And each time he tells the story, he learns something new about what was actually going on and learns more about the characters. So he first finds out about his wife, then he finds out about his best friend's wife, then he finds out about his best friend. And at the end of the story, he ends up identifying with and feeling sympathetic for his best friend. The person who was really the villain in all of this is the wife that he loved and cared for. We literally are watching his brain work as it discovers the truth of the story he's telling. And it's an absolutely fascinating story. It's a brilliant narrative. And it's really actually an entertaining novel, too. It's one of my favorite novels. The Victorian novel had this omniscient narrator who knows everything that's going on. Ford Madox Ford's novel, The Good Soldier, has a narrator who literally knows nothing about what's going on but discovers it as he tells the story. So we talked about Henry James. We talked about Henry James adopting the point of view of a specific character. Another method, a very prominent method that you're probably familiar with in some form or another, is something called stream of consciousness. And stream of consciousness is a different kind of realism. It's another way of representing reality, because the reality that we perceive is not necessarily objective reality. One of the things that we know, and one of the things that philosophers were pointing out at the beginning of the century, is that perception is reality, that what we believe is true is what we act upon as true. And we might not necessarily actually see objective truth, that everything we see is filtered through our culture and our personal preconceptions and our past experiences. So everyone has a somewhat different reality. In capturing the mind in the act of perception and thinking, the narrator, the stream of consciousness narrator, actually is presenting that form of reality. They're presenting the reality of perception. We're watching the mind think and perceive. The most famous, obvious example of a modernist stream of consciousness novel is James Joyce's Ulysses. Although Virginia Woolf also has The Waves and has some sort of stream of consciousness even in Mrs. Dalloway. So stream of consciousness is an attempt to give us psychological reality, giving us the mind directly, giving us where reality really sort of exists for individuals. All of these narratives are rejecting the sort of fixed objective reality that characterizes the Victorian novel with the omniscient narrator, where there's this sense that there is something that's true and real and the narrator has possession of that, giving us a much more human form of reality in these narratives. Now, Virginia Woolf herself was an experimenter. She herself is the daughter of Sir Leslie Stephen, an eminent Victorian himself. So she's really experimenting with different ways of telling stories. And her first stories, The Voyage Out and Night and Day, were very much more conventional kinds of narratives. And in fact, in The Voyage Out, we meet Clarissa Dalloway and Richard Dalloway for the first time in that narrative, who come back here in Mrs. Dalloway. With To the Lighthouse and the later narratives, and then Mrs. Dalloway and The Waves and Orlando, she becomes increasingly experimental with different ways of telling stories. And so we're sort of catching her here in her early experimental mode. And so there are moments where this is sort of a conventional novel, but then there are moments where it really does sort of verge into a much more experimental sort of novel. And one of the places you can see this in this narrative is when she switches perspectives and she keeps jumping from mind to mind.
In fact, one of the tricks about learning to read this narrative is figuring out whose mind we are looking through at any given moment. The narrative shifts back and forth from different characters, sometimes for just an instant, sometimes for a long period of time, without warning. And so at one moment, you will be looking at the world through the perspective of Mrs. Dalloway in this free indirect discourse. And at the next moment, you are seeing Mrs. Dalloway from outside, from the perspective of Scrope Purvis, her neighbor, who sees her as something bird-like. In order to understand what's going on in the narrative, you need to be constantly asking yourself, from whose perspective are we seeing the events of the narrative? Another important element to pay attention to in this novel is the passage of time. Time is an important element of any novel, and in fact, in his essay, Forms of Time and Chronotope in the Novel, formalist literary critic Mikhail Bakhtin describes the artistic chronotope. Chronotope comes from the Greek words that mean time-space, and in a novel, time can become an intrinsic part of the setting of the novel. It can become part of the landscape in which a novel takes place. In fact, time is part of the intrinsic distinction between the plot and story of a narrative. The story of a narrative is the list of events that take place in the narrative. The plot is the way those events are arranged and presented to us by the narrative. And the plot may not necessarily follow the story. Events can be presented to us out of order. Think about a television show in which they show us a scene, and then the next scene starts off with the words, 3 days earlier, and it takes us back to show us how we got to that point. So the plot has presented the story events out of order. Also, events can telescope. An event that takes just a few seconds to happen in real time can take multiple pages to describe. So something that's very exciting can take 4 or 5 pages to describe, and then the narrative can pass over 20 years in the space of a sentence. This idea of the telescoping and contraction of time is related to the idea of duration proposed by philosopher Henri Bergson, whose ideas about time and reality were widely discussed during the period Virginia Woolf was writing. In his theory of duration, Bergson proposes that we tend to think of time as this clearly demarcated regular progression forward, marked by the hands of the clock as they click forward at regular intervals. But none of us actually experience time that way. Experiential time, the reality within which we work, passes at different rates depending upon what's going on. For example, even though at this point we're only about 14 minutes into this video, it may seem to you that you've been watching this video for several hours. On the other hand, you can probably remember days when you were having a tremendous good time, when the whole day seemed to pass in just a few minutes. We experience time differently depending upon what's going on. The experience of a few minutes can seem to take hours, and the experience of a few hours can seem to take seconds. And so we experience time at a different rate from what clock time indicates. This notion of duration lends itself directly to the way that time is used and manipulated by authors in constructing the narratives of novels. Also, the narrative can take us back in time. Meanwhile, back at the ranch, for example. So, time is an important constitutive element of any narrative. But also, it can become part of the setting of the narrative. For example, in Charlotte Bronte's novel Villette, there is a scene in the latter part of the novel in which the main character, Lucy Snow, is ill. She has a fever, and as part of her fever, she becomes delirious. And during her delirium, she leaves her bedroom where she is sleeping and goes wandering through the city of Villette. And the whole scene has this vague, fugue-like, drawn-out circumstance where time doesn't really have any clear meaning. On the other hand, you can have a narrative where something very exciting is happening and time seems to speed up incredibly, even though the narrative actually draws out the events so that one thing is happening immediately after another. So time can actually be part of the setting of a novel. This is part of what Bakhtin describes as the chronotope. He says in his essay Forms of Time and Chronotope in the novel, in the literary artistic chronotope, spatial and temporal indicators are fused into one carefully thought out concrete whole. Time, as it were, thickens, takes on flesh, becomes artistically visible. Likewise, space becomes charged and responsive to the movement of time, plot, and history. This intersection of axes and fusion of indicators characterizes the artistic chronotope. The chronotope in literature has an intrinsic generic significance. It can even be said that it is precisely the chronotope that defines genre and generic distinctions, for in literature, the primary category in the chronotope is time. Time is an essential element in the narrative of Mrs. Dalloway. The story takes place in one day. It starts when Mrs. Dalloway leaves her house in the morning to buy flowers for her party that night because her maid Lucy is unable to buy them because she's getting the house ready for the party. And it ends at that party. And the march of time forward is marked by the striking of the clock of Big Ben. And it repeats that over and over through the narrative. Its leaden circles dissolved into the air, which reminds us of the hour-by-hour progression of time through the narrative. But while the time marches forward, also time continually regresses, because as we meet each of the characters and as we are inserted into their minds as they perceive the world around them, the characters are constantly remembering events from the past. And so as time moves forward chronologically, it also shifts back retroactively or retrospectively through the memories of the characters. So we're not only seeing the events of this day, but we're also seeing the events of the past years as remembered by those characters that have brought us to this day and shaped the way this day occurs. And we see them looking at the same events through different perspectives. Both Clarissa Dalloway and Peter Walsh remember one very important event in both of their lives, the time when Peter proposed to Clarissa and Clarissa turned him down. And both of them go back and remember that essential event in their lives, but they remember it each from their own perspective, remembering it a different way. And that memory pops up at different points in the narrative. It starts off right at the beginning of the narrative when Clarissa, going out to purchase the flowers, immediately as she opens the doors, remembers opening the doors at Burton, her family's vacation home, when she was a young girl, during the summer, during which she decided not to marry Peter Walsh and to accept Richard Dalloway's proposal. The final element that you need to keep in mind when you're thinking about the modernist novel is the historical context. Mrs. Dalloway takes place immediately after the conclusion of World War I. And World War I was the event that put the final nail in the coffin of positivism. In the 19th century, the majority of people believed that England and English society was at or reaching the pinnacle of human civilization. Think about Marlowe's description of the ideal of civilization and the capacity for faithfulness to that ideal exemplified by the intended and her belief in Kurtz's motives and behavior. The majority of people in English society during the 19th century believed that human perfectibility was not only in reach but nearby, that humans were reaching perfection, and that English society and civilization were the highest achievement of human civilization in the history of humanity. However, in the latter part of the 19th century, events like the Crimean War and the Boer War threw that belief into doubt. But World War I, with the level of destruction not only of human life, but of property and villages, demonstrated that humans were nowhere near perfection. One has to remember that World War I killed humans and created destruction on a scale and across an area never before witnessed by humans. And the new weapons that were available for World War I, mustard gas, aerial bombing, machine guns, long-range artillery, heavily armored warships that could shell a location from 20 miles away, barbed wire. All of those things created a capacity for destruction that no one had ever seen before. And England, during World War I, along with the continent as well, lost a whole generation of young men. All of the English males of a certain age during World War I were either killed or maimed. There was not a family that was not affected by someone being either killed or physically or psychologically damaged in a significant way. In fact, plastic surgery was developed in the first part of the 20th century as a way of correcting the physical disfigurement that came from artillery, explosives, or mustard gas. It was impossible to escape the destruction that World War I cost Europe. And in terms of this novel, cost England and English families. There is a character in Mrs. Dalloway, Lady Bexborough, who is opening a bazaar. That means starting a party. And she's doing it holding in her hand the telegram that informs her that her favorite son has been killed in battle. Now, in this novel, the war is over. England is starting to recover. But the evidence of the war is the disillusionment in humans and in the perfectibility of human society, demonstrated not only by those people like Lady Bexborough, but also by people like Septimus Smith. Septimus Smith is a war veteran. His best friend Evans has been killed in the war at a battle near the end, and he is experiencing shell shock, what we now know as PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. But at the time, it was very poorly understood, and the treatments for it ranged from ineffective to actually damaging. They ranged from Dr. Holmes' idea that he should just drink some porridge and get outside a little and cheer up, to Sir William Bradshaw's belief that he needs to be locked away in a room for 6 months and fed bread and milk. So World War I and the violence and destruction of World War I forms an unavoidable subtext for this whole novel. In her notebook, which Virginia Woolf called The Quarry as in a place where one collects stones for building, Virginia Woolf wrote, Mrs. D sees the truth, SS sees the insane truth. And what that suggests for us is that both of these characters are reacting in different ways to the truth of the society with which they're confronted. Both of them see the same problems with society and have their own ways of dealing with it. And as we discuss the novel, we'll be looking at these two complementary ways of looking at English society and addressing the problems of the lack of meaning and disillusionment that takes place as a result of World War I. Remember that this is the period of existentialism, which is characterized by a loss of belief in any transcendental realm. There is no greater truth above society. Carlyle's idea of a mysterious realm which must be manifested through work no longer exists. There is only what happens now. There is only material reality. And this novel is about the search to establish some new form of meaning in a society which has been deprived of its faith in any permanent transcendental sense of meaning. And we'll be looking at how that is manifested in the novel in the next video.